Hello everyone, and welcome to week 7 of English 213. This week you're going to be reading the introduction on the 16th century. We're moving into a whole new century, and it's a fascinating section, so don't skip it. You're also going to read Sir Thomas More's Utopia, another fascinating read, and Sir Philip Sidney's The Defense of Poesy, which is the defense of poetry, also very good. We're going to have a conversation about More's Utopia, and there's a quiz based on the 16th century introductory information. So let's talk a little bit about the 16th century. So that's the time that spans from 1485 to 1603. And really the two main figures that we as a modern society think about during this time, which is called the Renaissance, or the early modern period, are the famous playwright Shakespeare and poet, and the famous Queen Elizabeth. These are kind of the figures that have made it through time to us, and they certainly were very, very important figures during this time. But in order for us to really understand the entire period, we have to look at more than just those two figures. It's important to remember that during the beginning of the 16th century, the English language wasn't widely spoken. It was only spoken in England, and the international language was Latin. So when you were in school, you would be learning things in Latin. In fact, one of the texts we're reading this week, More's Utopia, wasn't written in English. It was translated from Latin. There's two real names for the era that we use. The first is Renaissance, which means rebirth, and that comes from what was happening in Italy slightly before this, and that was the idea of a rebirth of the arts. It's not to say that the arts weren't happening in the time periods before, but in the Renaissance, the arts really took to be part of the entire society. The early modern period, it's called the early modern period because this is really where the foundations for our current age began. The Tudor court, which began with, which ended with Queen Elizabeth, and which began many years earlier with her father, Henry VII. Henry VII begins, and then Henry VIII is the father of Queen Elizabeth. At the death of Queen Elizabeth, there was a huge shift in English society, and we'll be looking at that after we get through the 16th century. There were also huge changes in how people got information. So before Martin Luther and the Reformation, when people received information, especially about the church, before Martin Luther in 1517, they received it from their congregation. Most people were illiterate, and they would sit in a Catholic ceremony, and they would hear the sermon would be given in Latin, which they did not understand, and so most of their spiritual practice was a matter of ritual, of performing ritual, and then of the smaller kind of ceremonies that they would do privately, like with feast days and things like that, which were smaller and much more hands-on than their actual going to church. But when the printing press was invented, things started to shift. The Bible was printed. People learned to read. Information was distributed that way. And when people read, because in the past, when people would read something, they would read it as an act of communication with other people. But reading changed into a private act. So when it used to be that if you were reading something in during this era, you would read it aloud, no matter what. Everyone would be sitting by themselves reading their books aloud. But that shifted, that people started reading in their head, and it's a really big shift. The other big shift that happened was the rise of humanism, which is classical education where Roman and Greek literature is studied not just as literature, but as moral, political, and philosophical truths. Now, up to this point, Latin literature, the Roman literature, was included to an extent, especially any religious literature, but the Greek literature was not included. And so you see in a lot of the literature we're going to be reading, the Greek myths coming back, a lot of translations of Greek texts, and a lot more need to translate some of the greater books like Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. That was done by George Chapman. Plutarch's Lives of the Noble Grecians and Romans was translated by Sir Thomas North, and Ovid's Metamorphoses was translated by Arthur Golding. The Reformation was when there was a huge switch from England being a Catholic state and being controlled by Rome, basically, to becoming a Protestant state where literacy and a self-understanding of Scripture was valued. So huge changes happened during this time period, and that may be part of the reason why so much great literature was created. We are going to have a lot of fun looking at the literature from this period. This week we're going to be looking at Thomas More's Utopia, which is it was published in 1516. And this was written for a humanist. It was written by a humanist. Thomas More was a humanist. In fact, I think he had his head cut off for being a humanist, basically, for asking these questions. And he wrote this for an international community of humanists. It was written in Latin, and he wrote it to describe the stance of the humanist intellectuals toward monarchical government. So he was standing up against the throne. This is an early example of science fiction, one of the first in English literature, and it challenges the very foundations of social life. The word utopia was coined by Sir Thomas More. You may have heard it before. To us it means this ideal society, the opposite of dystopia, which is a very corrupt and terrible society. So utopia was coined by More. It means no place in Greek, which is really interesting to me. It's made up of two books. The first book is a debate between More and Hythloday over whether enlightened intellectuals should seek employment as royal counselors, or if they should remain aloof to public affairs. And then the second book is the description of utopia. So while you're reading it, I'd like you to think about these questions. And there's one more question that you'll see added when you go into the discussion forum. But just as always, I'd like you to use examples from the text to support what you're saying. This is really important because this teaches you how to argue your point using the literature, which is what we're going to be doing. I'm going to assign your first paper next week, and that's what it's going to be asking you to do. So the first one is, what is the relationship between Book 1 and Book 2? What light does each shed on the other? So look at the relationship between these two books. I'd also like you to think about, why is this considered a humanist text? So from your understanding of humanism that you got from reading the introduction on 16th century and any other outside work that you've done in this lecture, hopefully, why do you think this is a humanist text? How should we read More's rejection of utopian communism in the last paragraph? Do his reasons seem valid? What do utopian uses of gold, such as for chamber pots, suggest about the nature of economic value in utopia? And why does More make slavery so essential to the functioning of a utopian society? Finally, why does More set utopia in the New World? I'd like you to think about what that means, the New World, during this time period. It certainly was different than what we think of that term now. You're also reading this week something you're not going to be talking about, but we will be referring to throughout the next couple of weeks, and that's the Defense of Poesy by Sir Philip Sidney. This is a prose treatise that argues for the central importance of poetry in the history of Western literature and civilization, holding it superior to both history and philosophy. So basically what this treatise is saying is that poetry is where we should get all of our morals, all of our history, all of our philosophical ideas should come from poetry. We're going to be using this as a way to understand Renaissance poetic theory. So the hierarchy of the genres, and the humanist idea that poetry has a high moral purpose. I'd like you to look at how Sir Philip Sidney examines Chaucer. You may remember Chaucer from when we read the Canterbury Tales, and how he praises him for transcending the values of his quote-unquote misty age, right? Moore, the man who wrote Utopia, is congratulated for his conception of this utopian world, but he's criticized for his performance. So pay attention to, he's also, there's also a reference to the Fairy Queen, which we're going to be talking about next week when we're reading it. But pay attention to the ideas in this. I know sometimes it's difficult to digest the defense of poesy, but it will all make sense in the next couple of weeks. Okay? You guys are all doing great. Hang in there. Next week we're going to be reading the Fairy Queen, the first part of it. It's amazing. It's an amazing text. And we're going to begin looking at a couple of poems in addition to that, most likely. There'll be a conversation, and I will be assigning your first paper, and you'll have about 2 weeks to complete that paper. All right, guys, let me know if you have any questions. As always, I'm here to answer them. I look forward to seeing you guys online.